Yes, good evening, everyone. Welcome to RePEcT Talks broadcast. Today's topic is the progressive era. We are going to listen Professor Vallet from France. Uh, Mr. Professor, yes, if you are ready, have your say, please. Have a good
Thank you very
presentation.
much. Yes, I am ready. So thank you very much and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present a paper on the progressive era today. I would like to thank Professor Sema Yilmaz Gens for this kind invitation, and I'm truly honored by this invitation. So thank you very much. I am a professor of economics at the University of Grenoble, France, and I work on the progressive era, which is a very interesting period, as I will try to stress today. It is very difficult to capture all the features of the progressive era, since the period encompasses a large range of events or of new ideas and so on. So today I'm going to focus mainly on some authors of the progressive era, some scholars of the progressive era, and also on the issue of inequalities taken in a broader sense. And I will take the opportunity to present a recent book I have edited on the topic. This book is entitled Inequalities and the Progressive Era, Breakthroughs and Legacies. So I will give a short view on the content, but here you can have, you can see the outline of my presentation. I will follow three parts, and now I begin with the first, dealing with the intricate patterns of the progressive era. The progressive era covers a period beginning in the 1890s and ending in the 1920s. Historically, this period followed the Gilded Age period. As its name suggests, the progressive era calls to mind a large raft of policy advances which dramatically transformed American society. For instance, many historians associate these transformations with the ascendancy of Teddy Roosevelt to the presidency in 1901, and this era of relatively egalitarian economic and political reform continued through the presidencies of William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson until the 1920s. On the whole, egalitarian policies during the progressive era paved the way for New Deal reforms. So it is very important to connect these two periods, as I will stress later when I will present the book. So although this vision truthfully reflects a tangible historical reality, we cannot view the progressive era as an unfolding smoothly over time. This period was in fact a double-edged sword for Americans, an era characterized by deep changes and continuity, by great and unprecedented opportunities, but also by a rise in inequalities of different types. You can see here on the screen the different changes or the different elements dealing with the continuity, and the progressive era was in the middle of these two paths. Within this 30-year span lie several distinct sub-periods instead of a single macro phase, including, as I already mentioned, and it is written here on my slide, but the end of the Gilded Age, the American industrialization during the Second Industrial Revolution, the issue of class warfare in the US, the First World War, and also the beginning of the so-called roaring 20s. But we can say that, in my view, there are three main features of the progressive era, namely industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. And you can see here on the screen some figures illustrating the importance of these three main features of the period. And in my view, there is a key underlying issue of these underpinning these three main features of the progressive era. As I will try to demonstrate in my presentation today, I think at stake at the time was the building of the American nation with its positive and sometimes also with its negative aspects. But let's focus now on the issue of inequalities. As I have already mentioned, the period was for the most part marked by a rise in inequalities. Especially at stake was the strong concentration of capital, particularly evidenced by the rise of big firms and trusts. It is not worthy to give you an example that just between 1895 and 1904, 157 new holding companies consolidated 1,800 firms, and 72 of these new mega firms controlled at least 40% of the market in their respective industries. So in many markets, there was many big concentration of capital with huge monopolies and big firms concentrating such capital. The graph here displays the uptrend of the rise of inequalities resulting from capital concentration, which was, as I have already said, one of the main salient and buoyant issues of the period. Therefore, at the time, as a result, the industrial question became central, and time was ripe to improve labor relations and workers' conditions. However, of course, at stake were also related issues dealing with inequalities, such as the women question, the racial questions, the regulation of child labor, and so on. But this is just, for me, it is important for me just to remind you how important the issue of inequalities was at the time. And in this regard, the progressive era was a turning point in the American history, since it saw a shift in the perception of inequalities among all the key sections of American society, scholars, of course, but also in the medias, in politics, and so on. For instance, and you can see here the evolution of union membership of the period, it is here little surprise to see that union membership rose during the period, and the creation of the American Federation of Labor in 1886 exemplifies this trend. More broadly, there was also a desire for new social institutions in which participations from citizens rose, including a large range of civic organizations and social movements. And this is why, in this context, the issue of progress was addressed. Because the mechanisms through which these changes occurred were varied. Rising economic equality was generated by the establishment of universal high school education, of course, with the rise of union membership, as I have already mentioned. There were also important financial reforms, including the creation of the Federal Reserve System. And what was new was the creation, the designing and the setup of progressive taxes and the idea of more public spending. I can add that there were also political reforms, including the direct elections of US senators and expanding suffrage for women. In fact, in my view, many Americans of the time felt that rapid industrialization, immigration, and urbanization that I have mentioned had created too much social and economic instability. So for them, for people in general, for scholars, for politicians, time was ripe for the devising of a new economic, political, and social order, implying changes in politics and, of course, involving a new role for the state, as it is written here. Many progressives, such as Richard Ely, who is quoted here, considered the state as the main institution capable of implementing social policies and laws targeting inequalities as a goal, and of improving the well-being of society as well as individuals within it as an end. In this vision, the state must be understood in the broad sense of politically organized society, embodying the general will of a given society and originating from the plain people. In other words, these progressives regarded the state as an institution implementing social and economic policies, aiming to reduce inequalities while maintaining economic efficiency. This was very important in their view. Most of them wanted to preserve capitalism. In politics, more broadly, the progressive era was characterized both by a rise in bipartisan activity in Congress and also in political consensus. These were the two facets of politics of the time. Of course, indeed, on the one end, there were still some divisions, some debates between Republicans and Democrats of the times on very important issues such as race, for instance. But on the other hand, progressive ideas disrupted existing party coalitions. Some issues cross-cut the parties and sometimes reshaped them. The presidential election of 1912 exemplifies this with three candidates that I have already mentioned, Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, were all anchored to progressivism. All supported in particular anti-monopoly initiatives and a progressive federal income tax. It was quite new for the time. Likewise, in their latest insightful book entitled The Upswing, Robert Putnam and Schelling Romney Garrett observed that on 10 major reforms passed between 1906 and 1919, the administration in power, either Democrats or Republican, received on average the support of 78% of the House and Senate members of its own party, but what is more important, as well as 40% of the votes of the opposing party. So it is worth here reminding these figures and this example, since the period is associated with key reforms, including the creation of Interstate Commerce Commission, the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Federal Income Tax, tariff cuts of 1913, the creation of the Federal Reserve, and so on. And there was a kind of consensus on this issue, on these issues between Republicans and Democrats, exemplifying the common will to improve the global progress of American society. But during the progressive era, It is also worth mentioning that there were many local movements led by ordinary people. These people emphasized the need for change and even experimenting. They experienced new measures or new policies at the local scale. It was the case in Wisconsin, for instance, but also in Chicago as well. Some of these movements, local movements, sometimes grew to national efforts and sometimes also were connected with international movements. It was the case for feminism, of some feminist movements of the time, for instance. It was, for people leading these movements, it was a matter of democracy with the aim to give over government to people. But as it is written here on the slide, the common belief of the time was that change should come from experts. There was a faith in knowledge. Progressives and some people thought they could solve social problems, social and economic problems, by applying knowledge and expertise to them. But this faith in experts addresses crucial questions regarding the ideal of progressivism, but also regarding the way democracies function. If governments are legitimated by experts, what exactly is the point of democratic accountability, for instance? Likewise, what role do the people have other than to obey to these elites or to politicians ruling society as a whole? This no longer seems to be democracy. It is rather, at best, paternalism. But explicit arguments for paternalism cannot be squared with the rhetoric of democracy. The people still need to have an active role for a regime to be democratic. So it is one of the paradoxes of the time, and I will delve more into this issue later on. In spite of this crucial issue regarding, as I have said, the functioning of democracy and regarding the ideal of progressivism, progressives placed a high value on scientific solutions to economic and social problems, applying academic research and training to them. This explains why many universities associated with progressivism emerged. For instance, the Department of Sociology in Chicago, which was created in 1892, and also at the end of the period, the creation of the New School for Social Research, of course, with a different perception of progressivism, but these are two examples of these progressive institutions. But another important issue emerged. Where did these progressive ideas come from? To answer, it is worth going back to the beginning of the period and even before. Indeed, from the mid-1880s onward, the United States experienced a cultural transfer from German universities. Between 1820 and 1920, some 9,000 United States students received academic training in Germany. I can quote here the results of a survey conducted at the time in 1909 by Henry Fornham on the academic origins of American scholars in the social sciences. Of the 116 economists and sociologists Farnham interviewed, 59 studied in Germany between 1873 and 1905. All of them mentioned the quality of German courses, the quality of German training, and they owe German scholars a lot of their experience and their knowledge. Because when these American scholars came back to the US, they wanted to apply in the US the same things they viewed, the same knowledge they learned, the same policies which were devised in Germany, they wanted to do the same in the US. And this is why they were closed to morals. They wanted to incorporate, to integrate morals in the economic knowledge, and they were also close to Christianity and social gospels. They did not oppose this kind of moral on the one end and science to another one. In fact, their objective was twofold. First, to renew knowledge and methods in economics. Second, to provide policymakers with expert advice. To that aim, the American Economic Association was created in 1885 with the scholars such as Richard Ely taking the lead of the movement. The association emphasized in its statement of principles the key role of morals in economics, even though there were debates on that, and this decision was controversial, as we will see later. But we can see in this table, you can see the last column. For instance, many of the members of the founders of the American Economic Association during the early years of this association, these members were very close to Christianity and from close to clergy in general. A second characteristic of the creation of the American Economic Association was that it led to the professionalization of the discipline. Professionalization of the discipline meant increasing specialization, implying many changes within the profession. Specialization paved the way for individual associations. Indeed, at the beginning, the American Economic Association brought together many scholars coming from history, coming from sociology, coming from political economy, and so on. And this specialization led to a new form of scientific objectivity, transforming what economics referred to. There was an increasing role for empirical economics, promoting quantitative methods, for instance. And new influential scholars gained ground within the profession. For instance, Wesley Mitchell, John Bates Clark, or Irving Fisher at the time, especially during the 1910s. On the opposite, academics seeing economics as a mean of applying Christianity or Christian morality to the economic reality declined, and even some of them fell down within the profession. And this is why I can say that, to summarize, we can mention three main groups of scholars of the time who did not share the same view on the dynamics of capitalism in general and the associated treatment of inequality. In the group one, we can find social scientists, in particular economists, who supported the system as it was, recognizing the smooth functioning of the market and the primacy of economic individual liberty. They did not consider state interventionism as necessary and tolerated inequalities, since these inequalities were perceived as the consequence of the functioning of the market. In the second group, we can find academics advocating for individual liberties through the recognition of the superiority of social forces and the actions of the state that ultimately impact the global well-being. And for instance, Albion Small was among these scholars. And finally, the third group considered that the only way to put an end to inequalities, especially those stemming from capital concentration, was to change the whole economic system and maybe the whole society. This explains why some scholars of the group were close to Marxian ideas, for instance, and they were not their views were not really considered as viable alternatives So there is no doubt that many progressives, especially those from Group 2, were conscious of the risk of state degeneration, and it is even noteworthy that their support to the state vanished of a term for some of them. This is due first to the First World War, which was a major shock for the US. With the US joining the war in 1917, most American intellectuals who used to be close to German scholars and to Germany condemned Germany's attitude. They distanced themselves from German thinkers and from Germany. The attitude deemed belligerent of the German government, and the signing of what we have called the Manifesto of the 93 by German intellectuals ended their admiration for the Germans. Against this backdrop, borrowing German ideas to build American society appeared to be a mistake. It was increasingly difficult to apply German researchers' methods and recommendations to United States material conditions. The environment was changing, and the idea of America particularism or even exceptionalism resurfaced with the First World War. The borrowing to German ideas appeared even dangerous at the time because it was sometimes associated with the excesses of state interventionism. I have mentioned earlier Irving Fisher, for instance. It is noteworthy that when Fisher took the presidency of the American Economic Association in 1918, he voiced this concern. For him, he described the legacy from the German historical school as strange. I am quoting him, because this led to a belief in state intervention, reinforcing authoritarianism and even military conflict. And this could lead to a despotic state and what he called predatory economics. So it was a major change regarding the path of the progressive era. Likewise, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia in 1917, and there was considerable fear that revolutionary thought might spread through the United States. Suspicion fell primarily on academics presented as radical socialists or even revolutionaries. Progressives such as Ely or Small, for instance, were sometimes accused of being dangerous socialists by their intellectual rivals and even by journalists. Some scholars embodied the image of iconoclastic intellectuals or even troublemakers in academic institutions or maybe in the public life at large. Numerous examples illustrated that, especially at the University of Minnesota of the time. Likewise, universities faced increasing competition from research and sometimes mostly private research institutes. Founders which wanted to finance these institutes feared that the scholars within it were too much close to revolutionary ideas. So if scholars wanted to be founded on some project, they have to show off that they were not socialists. To conclude on that, I will say that two key issues could be addressed or should be addressed. First, what being progressive really means or really meant at the time. In fact, progressives of that time refer to an heterogeneous range of individuals. It is certain that they shared characteristics in common. I agree with Tim Leonard, for instance, when he stresses that what unites them is the common belief in the possibility of progress of humankind. But in my view, we can go further, emphasizing that they were obsessed by what they called the improvement or the reproduction of race. And I would say that they sought to build and to improve the American nation, as I have mentioned earlier. Having said that, being progressive referred to a wide range of stances with respect to many issues and concerns of the time. Let me give you some examples. Some progressives had an undemocratic view of science, such as small or illy. They denied individuals the ability to choose and to define the common good. On the opposite, others, such as Henry George, was to some extent more critical toward scholars' expertise and believed in the possibility of the education of masses, for instance. Second example, some progressives, maybe more those of the late 19th century or the early 20th century, firmly believed in the action of the state. To quote Tim Leonard once again, they had an extravagant faith in administration. I am not sure such a faith was so extravagant in reference to inequalities of the time and the need to devise new rules and a new deal. But it is undisputable that such a faith existed. And on the opposite, Giddings or the later John Bett Clark, for instance, became increasingly in favor of free market. A last but not least example, as Cléo Chassonnery-Zaïgouche underlines, there was a progressive paradox. In the sense, progressivism of many of these authors led to the exclusion of the migrants, the Afro-Americans, women, and more broadly of people judged as disabled. And thus, these people were judged as unfit regarding the key issue of the time, namely to build a strong American economic nation. This explains why you can find some sometimes strange and even shocking writings in reference to our modern conception of, let's say, racism, homophobia, or other issues of that type. It should be mentioned that scholars or leading progressive figures of the time, Ely, Ross, Gilman, for instance, were in favor of eugenics, for instance. Likewise, the woman question led to awkward debates on the alleged link between industrial work and deteriorating maternity, on the usefulness of a minimum wage for women, for instance. Without denying the reality and the violence of these views, it is also important to understand them in their sociological meaning. These views referred to the evolutionary and even social Darwinism approach of these authors, involving the idea of differential development of social groups. This is also, of course, once again related to their obsession of the improvement and the reproduction of race. These scholars wanted to build a stronger American society, and because of that, agreed with the idea of putting aside some groups, not because they did not appreciate them, but because they were seen as unfit. We should appraise their thought in their historicity, and I think there is still a lot of things to do on that very important issue. The second question, which is written here, is the following. If we address the issue of progress in its given meaning that I have given in this presentation, we should wonder if such progress was an exclusively American phenomenon. And besides the US, similar trends of thought emerged in other parts of the world, which shared the goal of human progress. Let me remind you that one of the key features of the progressive era was the increased mobility of some social groups, such as intellectuals. And as a result, these intellectuals could draw parallels between different contexts and gradually began to believe in the possibility of spreading reforms from a society to the next. The progressive era was a time, you have understood that the progressive era was a time of profound upheaval, and time was ripe in every corner of the globe to implement these reform. And this is what I had in mind when I decided to edit this book, and this will be my third and last part. So I won't spend too much time on it, but I just want to emphasize that this book is the outcome of a collective work from the onset to the end. And I would like to thank here once again all the authors of the book who accepted to follow me in this great adventure. I would like to thank Elgar for accepting to publish this book, and of course to thank also Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon from the Laurentian University, who supported me in this project and was really in favor of the publication of the book. So as you can see, the book has three main parts. It deals either with the foundations of inequalities, or it can also deal with income, capital, and land inequalities. And finally, it copes with social inequalities at large. So all the authors of the book focus on a particular type of inequality, or also focus on neglected authors, of course, from the US, but as I have said, on authors coming from from other parts of the world. And I think that there is a great complementarity between the different chapters of the book, and I will be happy to answer on some questions on the book after my presentation. What can I say to sum up? Each of the authors of the book address key issues on race inequalities, gender inequalities, monetary inequalities, or eugenics in relation to geographical and different cultural contexts. From this development, two remarks. First, our chosen period in the book, which starts in the 1890s and ends in the 1930s, encompasses more than the usual time span. Besides vindicated some historical research, this allows for greater coherence in the sense that the ideas that were framed during the progressive era served for reforms implemented in the 30s, for instance. A second feature of the book is the wealth of its contributions from international authors, each of whom sketch out a unique facet of the progressive era. And I think this is a fantastic and a great added value of the book, shedding light on neglected issues of the progressive era. Now, I'm going to conclude my presentation, spending more time on two very important issues in my view. First, can we learn from the progressive era? if we compare our period to the progressive era, it is certain that not every pattern looks exactly the same. The progressive era has its own historical features and specificities. The building of democracy and the building of nations in particular are very important and refer to a specific historical context. But we should also take into account changes in economic and social environment, but also in politics. In the US, for instance, there is a division, even a split today between supporters and voters of left wing within progressive parties. High skilled people still support progressive ideas, but former left wing voters have turned to right wing parties, sometimes extreme parties. Working class voters have abandoned left wing progressive parties. We have seen this phenomenon with the two last presidential elections. There are also new types of geographical divisions in many countries requiring to rethink the idea of progress. I have in mind the Yellow Vest movement in France, or the opposition between small towns and rural areas on one end, and metro areas on the other end in the US, for instance. Having said that, there are also some common points, and I think once again the book really helps to understand the kind of continuity, the historical continuity between inequalities over time, and also the dynamics of capitalism. So if we have lessons to draw from the progressive era, I think these are the following. First, regarding excessive inequalities. In the US, for instance, politics seems more polarized than at any time in the recent history. There is anger over racial or economic inequality. This is especially the case for some minorities, with a reversal of economic progress, especially African Americans. In their recent book that I have already mentioned, Putnam and Romney Garrett present evidence that the US of the Gilded Age, so the period just before the progressive era, was characterized by dramatic increases in economic inequality, political polarization, and so on. But during the progressive era, Americans succeed in building a more cohesive, a more egalitarian society. And to mention their own expressions, they succeeded in moving from an I society, more individualistic society, to a we society. And it's very important, and I think time is ripe now to devise a new we society, and to put an end to some discrimination and to excessive inequalities, because we are living in very extremely polarized and unequal society. The threat to democracy is that economic power translates into political power, and some people think that they don't have the choice to live, or they cannot change their lives, and that's a big problem. So this is why we should rethinking the concept of property. There are many writings of scholars, especially, for instance, Albion Small, I work on author, who have stressed the need to distinguish between the ownership of property and the use of capital, for instance. The third lesson is that we should devise new types of public policies related to taxation. This is key to build a more cohesive society. Just to give you an example here, you can see that during the 4 decades after 1975 in the US, there has been a kind of inverted U curve, and the wealthiest pay less and less taxes. And of course, when the government income falls down, you have less income to increase public spending and to provide collective goods, which are very important in functioning the ruling of our societies, but also of our economies, as the pandemic is unfortunately demonstrating. Last but not least, we should also rethink the link between people and the elites. I have mentioned that there was a kind of paradox within progressivism between these two parts. And today, maybe there is a kind of split or division between these two parts in our democracies, and that's one of the problems. Some people don't trust anymore their elites. But more importantly, this is evidence that we should try to devise new projects for new progress for our society. We are living in a very stressful environment. We need to find global solutions, and this requires the idea of progress. We should talk about using the concept and the word of progress, even devising sometimes some utopia. But I think utopia could be important to think about the ways to live better. And in this new project, of course, scholars have to play their role. They don't have to be trapped into their ivory tower. They have also to propose some solutions, to debate, and I think this is also one of the main lessons of the scholars from the progressive era. This is my conclusion. This is my last point. So I would like to thank you once again for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you very much.
Dear Professor, thank you very much, not only for your participation, also for the good presentation.
Thank you to you.
Undoubtedly, it's really important to having the book to understand to all points of the progressive era.
Of course.
Personally, I will have it as soon as possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to check our live streaming channels. If there is any question,
of course,
I will forward you. As I understand, there is no any question and everything is clear.
Perfect.
Perfect. Dear Professor, thank you again.
You're welcome, and thank you to you. It was a great pleasure, and feel free to stay in touch.